Hi, everyone. My name is Pat Gillette. I'm a former commissioner on the ABA Commission on Women in the Profession, and I'm honored to be here today to share an interview with Valerie Jarrett. Let me make some prefatory remarks before we hear from the wonderful Valerie Jarrett. As many of you know, since 1987, the ABA Commission on Women in the Profession has been addressing issues relating to women lawyers in our profession. Our first chair was Hillary Clinton, who set the agenda for the commission that the commission has followed, identifying challenges for women lawyers and advocating the solutions to those challenges to level the playing field. As a former commissioner, I can tell you that the women and men on the commission work tirelessly to change the visible and invisible barriers that have kept women out of leadership positions in our profession and in our country. But as we all know, change is like heaven. Everybody wants to go there, but nobody wants to die. And so real changes, impactful changes, have been slow to come. And as a result, women still languish behind men nationally when it comes to institutional power and compensation. However, as we open this conference on women, power, and disrupting the status quo, it's a hope of many of us that we stand on the precipice of change. That, to quote Dr. King, there's a fierce urgency of now as we leave the last 4 years behind us, as we garner strength and commitment from the Black Lives Matter movement, and as we clearly see the harsh reality that was punctuated by the events of January 6th, that we are in desperate need of leaders who will stand up and speak out. This conference is designed to arm all participants with the information and inspiration to fill that mission. And that is why we start today with our keynote speaker, Valerie Jarrett, whose reputation for speaking truth to power is legendary, and whose life story, as told in her best-selling book, Finding My Voice, is a powerful inspiration for all of us. Before we begin our conversations, let me give you a few highlights from the amazing life of the marvelous Valerie Jarrett. While she had a full and exciting life pre-Obama, she became a household name during his administration, where she oversaw the offices of public engagement and intergovernmental affairs and chaired the White House Council on Women and Girls. During her tenure in the White House, she also led the charge for workplace policies that empower working families, including issues around equal pay, raising the minimum wage, paid sick leave, workplace flexibility, affordable childcare, and a harassment-free work environment for everyone. And as if that wasn't enough, she led campaigns during the administration that resonate with the current issues we're facing in our country, including reform of the criminal justice system and reduction of gun violence. But don't think that any grass has grown under her feet since leaving the Obama administration. She's currently a senior distinguished fellow at the University of Chicago Law School and a senior advisor to the Obama Foundation. She's the board chair of When We Vote and co-chair of the United States of Women. And with all that, she somehow also finds time to serve on several corporate boards, including Lyft, Ariel Investments, Sweetgreen, and 2U. Plus, she's a regular commentator on a range of network and cable stations. So look for her on TV as well as here. This is a woman who seems to do it all, and she does it all with grace, humor, and grit. Valerie's easy to get to know, and from my conversations over the past year, I can tell you this. She's diplomatic, but relentless fighter for what she believes is right. She's solution-oriented and practical in her approach to professional and personal challenges, and she understands that the values upon which our country is based cannot and should not be compromised. As you will see, Valerie Jarrett inspires us to reach out of our comfort zone and into our hearts. So let's get going and hear from one of my heroes, Valerie Jarrett. Valerie, welcome.
Well, thank you, Pat. What a lovely introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Well, you know I always love talking to you. So this is my treat as much as a treat for all the people who are participating in the conference. So I want to start out sort of like Abraham Lincoln. You know, you were born in a log cabin, but you were not born in a log cabin. You were born in Iran and lived there with your American parents for 5 years. And as you say in your book, you were there because your dad needed a job, and the white hospitals weren't hiring Black doctors in the 1950s. So why don't you start out by telling us how much of that story affected the way you thought about opportunities for yourself?
Oh, it's a good question. So, in a sense, those first 5 years that I spent in Shiraz, Iran, Pat, were perfect in so many ways. I lived on a hospital compound with my parents. Families from all over the world were there. The Shah was in power. United States and Iran had very strong diplomatic ties back then. And my father was doing work that he cared passionately about. And it was seemed like the perfect environment for me. And I thought it was perfectly natural to spend my formative years with people who spoke a range of languages. And I didn't feel as though I was a black person back then because there weren't any other black people in the town that we lived in. And so my father wasn't a black doctor, he was an American doctor, and his presence there was celebrated and appreciated. And so the story that my parents told me as I got older was a story that began, as you said, Pat, with me being born there because my father couldn't get the appointment he wanted at an academic institution here in the United States, comparable to his white counterparts. But that was not where the story ends. The story ends with those 5 years in Iran and groundbreaking research that he did that caught the attention of researchers at the Galton Labs at University College of London. And so after 5 years in Iran, my parents moved to London for this 1 year, thinking that maybe they would be able to get back to America, but not knowing where. And then while in London, he gave a paper about the research that he had done in Iran and had continued in London. And the dean of the University of Chicago Medical Center was at the conference and offered my dad a job. And the University of Chicago is located obviously in Chicago, but on the south side in the neighborhood of Hyde Park, where my grandmother and my aunt and uncle and extended family all live. And so the story and the lesson that my parents said to me is that sometimes, in order to have what you really want, you have to be able to take the long way around. The shortest distance home might be the circuitous route. And so he ended up joining the faculty, became the first Black tenured faculty in the Division of Biological Sciences. And we lived in this neighborhood where I had this extended family. And so that was really more trust the adventure of life. Opportunity doesn't always knock where you wanted to, but be willing to take chances and do something that everybody else tells you is perfectly crazy, but it makes sense to you. And I think that's the lesson that stayed with me to this day.
So let's talk about that because it's so interesting having traveled across the world basically and ended up in Chicago and then moved on to a position of national prominence. But in your book, you talk about something that plagues a lot of women. And I'd love for you to share your thoughts on that. And that is something that we have a name for it, of course, imposter syndrome. You say, I had gotten into Stanford, but it was a mistake. Was it a mistake? Was affirmative action a factor? Did I belong? How did you overcome those kinds of self-doubts? Was it this beginning of, sort of I can do anything? What was it that allowed you to sort of move from that, am I really who people think I am, into the position you are now?
Yeah. So the reason why I didn't think that I would have a chance of getting into Stanford comes from a conversation I had with my college counselor. And he told me, you're not going to get in. And I think because I had grown up in this household where my parents believed if you worked hard and you had a dream, you should go for it and anything's possible. And look at my parents' lives. And so there was this tension between what he said to me and the way I had been raised. And so I hedged my bets by applying to 9 colleges and universities. But I applied to Stanford because I had wanted to go there since I was a freshman. And so when I got in, I did get in all 9. I still remember that. And I went to his office and I put all those letters down on his desk and I felt defiant and like I really did this and you didn't believe in me. But a piece of me, and this is what you're getting at, in the back of my mind, I was like, well, was it a mistake? Do I really belong here? And I will say it kind of stayed with me until I had a couple of semesters of grades under my belt. And I was like, well, I guess I do belong here. I'm doing pretty well. Uh, but for those first couple of, several months through the end of my first year, I really did question myself. And I think that there are a lot of people out there who are affected by somebody just putting a little kernel of doubt in your mind, or we put it in our own minds. And I will say, I was thinking about this the other day, Pat. I have never been offered a job that I felt qualified for. I've always felt like, oh my gosh, it's such a stretch. How am I going to do this? And that's also a part of the adventure, I think, of life. And to recognize what I think women often don't appreciate, which is that everybody feels that way. And if men say they don't, they're not telling you the truth. I mean, we all have self doubt, and I think what happens as you get older is that if you have enough success under your belt, two things happen. Number one, your confidence goes up. But number two, you realize that if you don't succeed, then okay, so you brush yourself up and you try again. And I think the resilience that we all need comes through those life experiences, both ones that work out and ones that do not.
And so do you think that that type of resilience can be taught? Or is it something that comes naturally to some people? I mean, how do you get that if you don't feel like you have it?
Well, some of it is temperament. Some of it you learn from the people you love who reinforce that, you should be resilient. And I certainly had the benefit of unbelievable amounts of love and support from my parents. And then some of it I think is just life experiences and it gets better with time. Being aware of the fact that we all have these insecurities and we all have the self-doubt at least makes you appreciate better than I did when I was younger that there's safety in numbers. I thought as I wandered through the Stanford campus, I was the only one who didn't feel that I belonged there. And I'm certain that now, in retrospect, that's not true. And
Yeah.
so there is something very comforting in knowing everybody has that emotion as opposed to I must be the only one that's sticking out like a sore thumb here.
Yeah.
Uh, but I don't feel like I was treated that way. I really do believe this was a problem I had within myself. And maybe, who knows, people said things behind my back, but once I started doing well, even if I had gotten in through affirmative action, it wasn't as though I wasn't able to compete.
Yeah, I remember calling my mom from college and saying, "Oh my God, everybody here was student body president. Everybody here is smart. I can't do this." And I think, people like you coming out and saying, "I feel that same way," makes such a difference and empowers women to think, "I'm not the only one," because that is so important. But let's talk about this plan you had. You're going to go to Stanford, you're going to go to law school, you're going to have a career, you're going to get married, have a baby, have a wonderful life. Women love to have plans. Lawyers love to have plans in particular. Your plan got derailed a little bit. So tell us about that. What happens when your plan gets derailed and how do you sort of pick yourself up and move forward? Should you even have a plan?
Well, so the subtitle of my paperback, which came out last April, was When the Perfect Plan Crumbles, the Adventure Begins. And the reason I focused on that part of my book is as I traveled on the book tour, it's that people were most curious about. Like, what do you do when things don't work out? And should you even have a plan to begin with? And I think plans are good. It gives you a direction. And but I think the caveat has to be that plans often don't work out, or you change your plan. You determine, you start out majoring like I did in human biology, and I had a disastrous experience. I shifted to psychology, which has come in handy, I will tell
Yeah.
you, probably more so than human biology would have. And that pivot is okay. And I think sometimes when plans don't work out, we think we failed. And no, life just got in the way. And so you create a new one. And you have to be willing to be flexible enough and resilient enough to face a disappointment. And I married the boy next door. I thought that would be perfect. It didn't work out. I went to a big law firm because that's what everybody in law school was doing. That didn't work out. And so I ended up getting a divorce, discovering that there's nothing lonelier than being in an unhappy marriage, and that I was a lot happier single. And I started working in public service and have never looked back. And I think as that begins to happen over the decades of your life, and you make these swerves, I'm not saying it gets simple because every time I do swerve, I still go through that, oh my gosh, oh my gosh. But then I talk to myself and I try to talk myself down and go, no, you've done this before. You know it's going to be exciting. You know it's going to be okay. It's going to be stressful in the beginning when it's new, but it will get better. And I think having those conversations with yourself is very healthy too.
Are there any choices that you've made in your life when those curves have come that you regret or in retrospect you think you should have done differently? And if so, how do you cope with that?
Interesting question. Have I made mistakes? Well, of course, a zillion mistakes. Do
I
I
think you're perfect, so I don't know.
do I regret any of the career decisions I've made? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Now, part of why is because each one brought new opportunities, and if I look back, do I wish I had stayed somewhere? Do I wish I had taken another job opportunity? No, because each one of them were kind of the building blocks that led me to my conversation here with you today, Pat. So why would I trade that for anything, right? But that doesn't mean that that the decisions I've made in those jobs have been always perfect by any stretch of the imagination. But no, I like the way things turned out. Of course, I have the benefit of hindsight, but I think it's important for your audience, particularly the younger ones in their career, to realize that at the time that I made those forks in the road, for example, when I left that law firm and I joined the Corporation Counsel for the City of Chicago, my parents, who I've already told you adored me and I adored them, thought I was making the most ridiculous life decision. My friends and family, I was their, the envy of everybody working at this fancy place, but it didn't fulfill me. And I walked into City Hall my first day, and I was on the same floor with the mayor, and I had been very interested in local politics after Mayor Harold Washington, the first Black mayor of Chicago, had been elected. But when my boss walked me back to my cubicle and he did like air quotes around cubicle, I did gulp. I'll fess up. I gulped and I'm like, what did you do here? And I got to like that cubicle, right? And I got very comfortable. But I did do that initial gulp. And I think that's okay too.
Yeah, yeah, and that's what's so important for people to understand is that it's not always gonna be perfect in the beginning, it may never be perfect, but it's an adventure, and that's
Sure.
yeah, and that's what characterizes your life.
Right?
So
And you'll meet people and you'll have relationships, professional and personal ones that hopefully many of them withstand the test of time. And that's important too.
yeah, and nothing is forever, that's what I love to tell people, nothing is forever, you make a choice, you're there for a while, and then you move on.
Right.
Um, so let's move our discussion a little bit to women in general, because we have a lot of participants in this conference who are from other countries. And in those countries, some of them have been far more successful than we have in advancing women into positions of power and leadership. So, do you think there's anything that we can learn from those countries? And would any of the policies or practices that they've used to advance women or to force women into positions of power, do you think those might work here?
It's a good question too, Pat. I think first of all, there's safety in numbers. You reach a tipping point where if you have, and this is applies to diversity in general and certainly women in particular, I do think that diversity is a strength. I believe it gives you a competitive advantage. I believe that if you, whatever business you're in, half the population is comprised of women, and it would be to your benefit as you try to think of how to sell your goods and services to be mindful of your marketplace. And so I have stopped approaching this issue from a perspective of it's the right thing to do, but more so that there's a business imperative for it. And I think that there are two issues. One, what are the steps that, say, some of the countries that you're thinking of, what are the steps that government took, whether it's requiring percentage of women on corporate boards, for example, and did that actually help change the culture? Because there are steps government should take, but then there are also important ways of women advancing, and that has to do with culture. And I think it's important for the two of them to come together. And that is more likely to happen, I think, when there are more women at the table. And that applies in the boardroom, but it also applies at every level in the organization. There was a study several months ago, I think it was McKinsey and the Wall Street Journal did, that showed that although the vast majority of CEOs thought that the diversity was a strength and having women at all levels of the workplace was important, that did not trickle down to the bottom rung of that ladder because men were still outperforming women in terms of promotions at that lower level. And so I say that it is important that business leaders think strategically about what are the impediments to ensuring that your diverse workplace exists and that it is a healthy culture there so that you retain that diversity and view it as a strength. And so then I think it's, how are you compensating people? If you don't compensate them by achieving those goals, you're signaling that it's not actually that important. It's a nice to do, not a must to do. And so I think there are lots of ways that people who are leading businesses and government should be mindful of the barriers, and that could be equal pay, it could be paid leave. The United States is the only developed country that doesn't have a national paid leave policy. We've seen with the COVID-19 how imperative that is, both for people who are trying to care for their children and people who are not well and don't have paid sick days sufficiently. So, uh, do do we have a culture where sexual harassment and violence is tolerated, or is one where that is not acceptable? All you have to do is to ask the women in your workplace, what are the issues that are barriers, and they'll tell you, and they tend to be consistent globally. And so addressing each of those issues, either voluntarily or with government imposing requirements, I think it's the secret sauce. The combination is what works.
So you've been in situations where I imagine, I don't know this for a fact, but where you've been one of the few women, or certainly one of the few diverse women on a board or in a leadership position. And there are people who say that diverse role models really make people who aren't in those positions view themselves differently and think about opportunities differently. Do you think that's true? And if so, were there any people who were role models to you, other than your parents who sound like they were wonderful, but other people in your professional or personal life who were role models who really influenced you to think that you could really do it all?
Yeah, so I do think that it's hard to be what you can't see, and that we all have dreams, but they're limited by what we think is the art of the possible. And so seeing somebody who looks like you makes it seem more possible. It's one of the many reasons I'm so excited about Vice President-elect Senator Harris, who she's a woman, she's Black, she's American Indian, she's got all of this richness of diversity, and children of all backgrounds now have a different image of what the second most powerful person in our country looks like. And I think that's good for everybody to grow up, and it changes the paradigm. And it also helps people who haven't had role models that look like them think, oh, I could do that too. And there was going around several weeks ago all these photographs of like 3, 4, and 5-year-old girls who were dressed up in a blazer and pearls and gym shoes, looking just like Vice President-elect Harris, and it was just the perfect thing that these little 4-year-old girls think I can be the Vice President of the United States. And so for me, my role models were not so much women in leadership roles, either in law or in business or in politics, because there weren't a lot of them. But when I worked for local government in Chicago, I did have a mentor who was the senior woman in the Washington Sawyer administration. And she was in charge of finance and development, huge portfolio. And everybody respected her and she demanded respect. And so she was a role model of what was possible with hard work. And she mentored me and she pushed me to ask for a promotion that I would have never asked for if she hadn't nudged me along. And I found out years later that she had actually gone to my boss and laid the seed work for it, and didn't tell me, made me go in there and ask for it. And I give her a lot of credit. And because she really opened up doors for me, it has been really important to me to appreciate how I need to mentor younger women who are coming behind me. And to quote Vice President-elect Harris, she always says, just because you're the first means you have a responsibility to make sure you're not the only.
So you hit on a topic that I think is one that we should explore a little bit further, which is there are some implicit biases that people have that impact the way they think about what's possible, um, and who's possible to do that. And so, with having Kamala Harris in the White House now, in a very powerful position, having people like you, and other women who are diverse and men who are diverse commenting on the political scene, having positions of power, do you think there still is an impediment to diverse leaders, potential leaders, to getting into positions of power? And how do you overcome those implicit biases?
Well, so the answer is yes, there are definitely still impediments. We still live in a world that is dominated by men in positions of power. Yet we have a record number of women in that were just elected to the House and the Senate, but we're nowhere near half, which is what we would be if there were going to be parity. And I think was it Justice Ginsburg who said, "How do you know when you have enough men on the Supreme Court?" And she said, "When they're nine." Perfect comment for her to make, right? Um,
Uh-huh.
but we should at least be equal in numbers, and I think that goes a long way to giving us all permission to be more comfortable too. And I'll tell you, Pat, I've been on certainly a number of corporate boards where I was either the only woman or the only black person, and you tend to feel as though you were carrying, the weight of that first on your shoulders, and that you have to be there to be the advocate for issues that are also important to those constituencies. And if there are more of you at the table, it's easier. It's just easier. And so I've always tried to fight to say, okay, just because I'm there doesn't mean we shouldn't have three more, or four more, or five more, and to keep that door open. So I'm not sure I answered your question, but
Yeah,
that's
you did.
my
No,
brief illustration.
that gets her, but let me follow it up with one, and that is Biden is Vice President, President-elect Biden, I guess, I'm trying to figure out what to call him, is has really made an effort to have a diverse cabinet. You've been in the White House, you've seen how power is wielded there. Do you think having that diversity in the cabinet will actually make a difference in the
Yes.
way Americans in general view the possibility of diversity being more prevalent in positions of leadership and power?
Yeah, I mean, I will say I was one of the co-chairs for the Obama Biden transition back in 2008, 9, and it was very important to them both, the cabinet and the White House, to reflect the diversity of our country. I was very proud that half of the department heads in the White House were women. I don't know of a White House had previously that had such a large number of women in positions of power in the White House, not just in the cabinet or in the administration, and it makes a difference. A few years ago, when the Senate was debating whether or not to repeal the Affordable Care Act, the leader of the Senate created a subcommittee to take a look at the issue, and they were foolish enough to let themselves be photographed, and it was all men,
I
like
remember.
19 men. And all I could think about is one of the major provisions that you're debating is the preventive care that's available to women for screenings for cancer or birth control. I want somebody who looks like me and has a uterus, quite frankly, at the table having that conversation, because you'll make a more informed decision. And I think that's the strength in the diversity, is that are you talking to people who have a perspective that will enrich the the decision making process. And we prided ourselves in the Obama administration of having those diverse perspectives and then helping empower people to speak up. Because another tendency that sometimes we have, and I think this does not go away the higher you go, is that if there are a lot of very loud, boisterous men in the room, women tend to shrink. And you have to feel this sense of, no, it's not about me, and don't take it personally when you have an idea and then 2 minutes later somebody raises the exact same idea, but that person's a man, and everybody goes, oh, brilliant idea, and you're thinking, am I invisible? Did I not say that?
Uh-huh.
You just have to come back at it because you're fighting for your ideas. And when you get that kind of in your head, better decision making happens. And so, yes, if we have a role model of an administration, particularly going through the challenging time now, where, let's face it, for good or for bad, more people are focusing on the role of government today than they were 10 years ago. And government looks like America, then I think it's another way that people feel not only the art of what's possible, but they feel invested in its success because they see people who look like them that are at the table making decisions. And there's also this factor of trust. If
Yeah.
I trust that I don't have to explain to Vice President elect Harris what it's like to be a Black professional lawyer, because she's been that, right?
Exactly.
And so
Exactly.
there is a familiarity and a potential for trust that I think is also one of the benefits of having leadership that reflects the people that they're governing, whether that's in business or whether that's in actual government itself.
So you spent some time during the Obama administration focusing on families and how we can make life easier for families so that we can continue to have diversity in the workplace for both men and women and people of color. Um, and so the pandemic has had the effect that are just beginning to realize of having more women leave the workforce because they don't have childcare, because they don't have support systems, because they can't afford to continue to work and also take care of their children. Um, what kinds of things do you think government can do to help take advantage of the pandemic to maybe advance some of these things that you were working on before, like paid leave and childcare?
Well, those are programs that are being mentioned now on the lead on the news. I mean, I think take paid sick days. Essential workers often are the ones, and I don't need necessarily in the healthcare field, but if you think about the people who are working in your grocery store, they don't, many of them don't have paid sick days. And they're low wage workers. And so they don't have the luxury of saying, well, I don't feel so good. I think I'll take the day off because they won't get paid or they may lose their job. And so they go to work sick. Well, hey, guess what? We don't want people with COVID-19 feeling as though they have to go to work sick. And so that's why Congress was so willing to put in benefits for paid sick days and paid leave, uh, uh, something that they had heretofore refused to do at the national level. And so, yes, I do think that this is an opportunity for the Biden administration to push forward on a national level programs that we know, having been laid bare from this pandemic, are so essential. So it would be requiring equal pay and with teeth in it, making sure that we raise the minimum wage. There are too many families who are raising their children in poverty. We've seen examples of food lines in our country, people who are at risk of losing their homes, and Congress again could step in and say, well, we can't evict people in the midst of this COVID-19. But what about all of the people who lose their homes in the course of a normal economy? What are we doing to give people the flexibility they need that we've all now been forced upon us as we are working remotely? But there are many occasions where it would be to the benefit of women in particular to be able to work from home, or to be able to say, I've got to take my child to XYZ, so I'm going to come in a little later or I'm going to come in a little earlier. It's not that you don't get your work done, but we need that flexibility. We've already talked about sexual harassment in the workplace, which is a huge waste of money, and not to mention trauma that businesses pay the bill for by having these environments that are either hostile to women or women who are experiencing domestic violence and have to take time off of work or come to work living the trauma of that experience. And so getting business to take a step back, and then of course the one that you mentioned at the outset, Pat, affordable childcare. And one of the many pieces of legislation that the Obama Biden administration presented to Congress was to make childcare more affordable, quality childcare more affordable, because even before the COVID, many women could not afford to work because they weren't going to make as much money as the childcare was going to cost. And so I think this is an opportunity for us to take a step back and say, what are all of the levers that we should be turning to level the playing field so that we could compete, and that working families would be better off for it. More and more men are now demanding the benefits that historically were deemed important to women. And I think that actually improves our chances of getting them through as well. I think about my son in law and his generation, his cohort, much more involved in parenting, for example, than my generation of men were. And I think that's a good thing for our children. And I think it's a good thing for our mental health. And I think it's actually good for society and will inure to the benefit of business.
Yeah, I always say when men start doing something, it becomes normal, right?
Yeah. Yes. How many times, Pat, have you heard, oh my gosh, a guy say, well, I'm going to go leave early for soccer practice? Oh, isn't he a wonderful dad? And you go to take the kid to the pediatrician, and people are going, is she committed to her work? Does she really
Yeah.
care about this? I mean, and now it is changing, but I remember months being pregnant before I told anybody I was pregnant because I was afraid they wouldn't take me seriously. And in a lot of instances, that is actually what happens. And so,
Yep.
yes, we need men to say, I want to have paid leave after my child is born too. And I do believe it should be equal. Men and women should have that same benefit.
Yeah, what I've noticed is there are a lot of baby boomer men who have daughters, and
Yeah,
all of a sudden it's personal. Now when it's their daughter who's being adversely affected by policies that have been in place forever to keep women from having equal opportunities, now it becomes an issue for them as well. So we sort of have a push me pull you, right? We have the older generation sort of pulling and the millennials pushing and Gen Z pushing from behind saying we got to have change now. So there's hope.
that's how
Let me
progress
ask
happens.
yeah. So, what do you think in terms of the women who are and men who are on this call? What is it that the legal industry can do to really push the agenda forward, to increase diversity, to improve racial injustice? What can we do as lawyers, as potential leaders to make effective change?
Well, I say start by getting your own house in order. This summer we saw demonstrations in all 50 states around the death of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, too many others to name here. And what was heartening about it is it was people of all backgrounds, all races, all ages saying Black lives do matter. And that's a very positive thing for society. But what I said to my peers in the business community was look, let's not just point our finger at police and say that we need better policing. Why don't we say, well, what are we doing as business leaders to address the issue of systemic racism? This isn't something that's limited to the police department. And so I say, in the first instance, lawyers who are in law firms, in working in corporations, working for not for profits, take a look at the business practices of your organization and say, do we have an environment that is conducive to inclusivity? Are we living by those values? And so that's in the first instance. And then our job is to help our clients realize it is in their self interest to address these issues as well. We've seen examples recently of companies that are no more because they look the other way on the issue of sexual harassment in the workplace. And so I think part of our job as we counsel in-house or on outside counsel basis, people who are running businesses or running not-for-profits or in government is what are we going to do to get our own house in order? And then as lawyers, certainly we should be advocating for the policies that are either able to be adopted by the executive branches of government at state and local and federal level, or that require legislation. And look, we spent 8 years trying to get Congress to pass all kinds of legislation. And when they wouldn't, we did a few things. We took that argument to the states. And so now many states have passed paid leave requirements, for example, or we would take it to the cities, or we asked voluntary pledges. We had businesses who took all kinds of voluntary pledges on equal pay, for example, where they said they would commit to look at the data and determine whether or not they were paying equally. And so I think we have to be the creative ones. We have the benefit of minds that think that way. And so why wouldn't we affirmatively bring these issues up when you're in a position to do so? And I guess that's the point I really want to make here. From my time practicing law and my time, maybe more importantly, as a client, is that the difference to me between a good lawyer and a really excellent lawyer is how proactive are you? Are you looking around the corners? Are you anticipating pitfalls that I might fall into? And are you helping me be better at what I do? And part of how we are better is to address these issues head on. And so I think there's lots of runway for lawyers to proactively raise these issues with their clients, with their places of business, with the people who are in government making decisions that affect all of our lives.
So we're almost out of time, but if you could say something uh, that you think would be impactful for young women who are moving up in their careers, who want to be in positions of leadership, what's the piece of advice you would give them as they think about what the next move is for them?
Well, I suppose I would say this is a marathon, it's not a sprint. And try to make decisions that are increasing the aperture of experiences that you have. Because as you increase that aperture, including the relationships that you build, it opens up doors for you that you don't even know you might want opened in 10 years. And so, yes, you can try to plan out 10 years, but more importantly, do the job you have really well, build relationships with the people with whom you work, be flexible and open to opportunities. I say opportunities never knock at opportune moments. You can always think of 100 reasons why you shouldn't grab that ring when it's coming out to you, but it might end up to be the brass ring. And so, and to also recognize the resilience that you are developing, and that if you stumble and fall, which you will, because if you don't, were you really trying hard enough? So it's okay to stumble and fall. The question isn't, do you fail? The question is, what do you do about it? Did you learn from it? Did it make you more resilient? Did you realize, oh, I could do an abysmal job and I'm still here, and I'm coming back stronger even. And so, and then the final thing, I suppose, which is consistent with the theme of my book, which is to thine own self be true. Don't be a spectator in your own life. Don't let other people define for you the contribution that you get to make in this short time that we are all here. You have to own that life and the decisions that you make and the trade offs that you make. I mean, certainly you asked me earlier on, could I look back and have done things differently? At the time when all of my friends were going out to parties and traveling and I had a young child, I'm sure at that moment I thought I regret not being able to do that. But now, Pat, you and I know we're both grandmothers, and some of my friends still have kids in college. So do I
That's right.
regret having her early? No, I don't. So it
Our
all makes sense in retrospect, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, Valerie, as usual, you're such an inspiration and such a positive force for all of us. And if we needed a role model, you provide that. So
Oh,
many
thank
thanks
you.
for taking the time to speak to with me
Thank
and with
you,
all the
Pat.
people
You too.
listening.
You
All
too.
right, take
Right
care now.
back at you.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye bye.